All right, good morning, class. Hopefully, you are up to date with the 4/5 lessons we've done so far. The first three on GDP output, unemployment, employment, and CPI inflation were the, three primer lessons to kind of get you familiar with the three economic indicators. And lesson five was about aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And so today we're going to talk about the business cycle. Which is going to be a relatively quick lesson, but it's going to start to bring together all these kind of concepts and kind of set the stage for us going forward, where we're going to talk about fiscal policy, leakages and injections, methods of manipulating aggregate demand to satisfy where we are in the business cycle. So on that note, let's think about taking up the homework. And so at this time, you should probably take out your homework and take a look at these answers. And so again, just take a quick look, and if you have any questions or aren't clear on some of the answers and how they may differ from yours, please send me a message and I'll get to it as soon as possible. Take a look at these sets of questions. And today our learning goals will be to know how to interpret the business cycle, the prosperity cycle, and the contractionary cycle, be able to explain the characteristics of each cycle and understand how the cycles work and how they may impact the economy. Our success criteria will be talking about the cycles. Obviously, I'll be talking about them, but in your heads and at home, you should be following along and taking part in kind of thinking about the aspects of cycles. And then also, obviously, the completion of your review and your homework. So we're going to start the lesson off just talking about types of cycles. So at home, I want you to think about different types of cycles that you may have learned about in school or I've heard about. And so in this time, you think about, what cycles have I been introduced to, maybe in science classes or math classes or geography classes and whatnot. And so a list that you would come up with might include the water cycle, the product life cycle from marketing, or life cycle, carbon cycle, accounting cycle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we talk about these cycles, there are going to be characteristics that are common amongst them. And that's the same with the business cycle. And so if you look at all these cycles, and for it to be called a cycle, it has attributes that make them distinct but similar to one another. And so all these cycles have qualities that are similar to one another. And so if you look at them all, you should be able to see patterns that exist where they repeat. You should see that each cycle has a different stage or a different mark point where you can tell when it's gone to the next point of its cycle. Cycles are most likely continuous. Cycles have things that go into them and outputs that they deliver. They're predictable. So if they repeat and they have stages, you can have some ability to predict what's going to happen next, given information. They progress from point to point. They have different parts. They have cause and effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about all the cycles that you've learned in the past, they will all share at least most of these attributes. And that's the same with the business cycle. And so when we look at the business cycle, we're looking at a cycle that we use to help characterize where our economy is. And so previously, the past 10 or so years, we've been heading up to and have been peaking as a global economy, especially in Canada, the United States. We've had record economic growth. And so we hit a peak. Even saying we hit a peak just at the end of 2019, at the beginning of 2020, before all this happened. And so you'll see that, and every cycle will go through this. Every business cycle will go through this. And so now you're probably thinking of us going into a recession or at least contracting, right? So our stock markets have gone down, even though they've rebounded a bit. Our economy has significantly slowed, and so maybe after this quarter, if we go into another quarter, a second quarter of contraction, we'll officially be in a recession. And at some point, our contraction is going to go deep enough where we're going to hit a trough, right? We're going to hit a point at a low where we're not going to go get worse, right? And so in the financial crisis of 2008, things were really bad for a while, and then eventually it hits a bottom, and then that bottom will probably bounce off that, or will slowly creep up after that into a recovery stage, into an expansion stage, and into a prosperity stage. And so when you look at what happened in 2008, we were in a financial crisis, a housing market crash in the States, and we went through a significant trough, a really, really bad trough. And then the previous trough before that was probably would have been seen as a tech bubble burst in 2001. And so you're going to see these troughs happen, and then from those troughs, we're going to expand and then ultimately hit a new peak. And then we're going to go through this whole cycle all over again. So if you can depict this with a graph, you're going to see that this graph, we show that time is on the x-axis, and so as time goes on, and then the output's on the y-axis. And so as time goes on, we'll see that GDP or output is going to be swinging with the curve, right? And so in 2008, we hit a trough, and then we expanded, recovered, expanded, recovered, expanded, and then we just hit a peak, and now we're contracting. And so if we contract for too long, we'll be into a recession, potentially a depression, and then eventually we're going to hit a trough somewhere. The ability to predict the trough is uncertain. We don't necessarily know when it's going to happen, but there will be a trough, and we will start trending up again. So it's important to understand that we are going to go through these cycles, and that's inevitable. And so it's good to understand that 2001 we hit a trough, or in that time frame, and then in 2008 we had another trough, and so there's roughly a 7-year time frame. Okay, and so historically we've looked at cycles going into like roughly 7-year periods, and we've in recent years been able to extend those cycles. And so, like I said before, since 2008, our trough, we've been in a recovery and expansion phase for a long time. Now it's 2020, so that's like about 12 years. And so we were due to hit the peak and start to go down again. It's just a matter of when was this going to happen. And obviously, what happened now is unpredictable to a certain degree, right? So we're not sure what would have happened if this didn't happen, but ultimately the peak cannot last. We cannot stay at that high level for too long. And so we're going to go through that. And so maybe a few years from now, or whenever, we're going to start bouncing off the bottom and going back up again. Another point to notice on this graph is that there's a trend line. Okay, and so if you see there's a growth trend here, and so you'll see the growth trend is actually a positive sloped line. It's important to understand that throughout time, as time progresses, GDP is naturally going to go up, and we're going to have small ups and downs, but overall, throughout history, our GDP will increase, right? And so our economy will grow. The globalized economy is going to eventually grow and grow and grow and grow. So we're never going to be shrinking for a long period of time, theoretically, and that's the hope, right? If we start shrinking as a global economy, that's big problems. And so the trend line is always going to be going up. So it's important to understand what these different parts of the cycle look like. And so we want to look at characteristics of a recovery or expansionary period. And so when we're recovering and expanding, our GDP should be going up, our prices should also be going up as we start to enter more output and economic activity is going to grow, prices will start to increase, right? Because employment's going to increase, people have more money, and prices will creep up. Consumer confidence will increase, spending will go up, production, income, all these things are going to continue to move up and move up and move up. And so it's good to understand, and we're going to tackle this in the next slide, that there are factors that contribute to other factors within the same expansionary period, right? Obviously, as employment increases, consumer confidence will increase, and then spending will go up. All these kinds of things kind of feed into each other. And so if you want to look at the characteristics of a contraction or recession, they're just going to be the opposite. And so in those time periods, GDP should be going down, prices should be going down, theoretically, employment should be going down, etc. So everything that's happening right now in our economy, GDP is definitely declining. Employment is definitely declining, right? People aren't going to spend money. And so even after a vaccine for COVID-19 is found and people are, free to go out, there's probably still going to be, some after effects or aftershocks of consumer confidence, uncertainty, and people will still not have jobs. People will have been scraping by, tapping into all their savings. So lots of these things are going to be happening. And so this is not like a sudden vaccine is going to change and flip the economy back. Yes, there's going to be cheering, there's going to be a bump in the stock market, all these kinds of things are going to happen, but it's not going to reverse the impact of what's already happening. So it's important to understand that we can't flip these things very, very quickly. So, like I said, we want to look at how do these things actually feed into each other. And so we're going to look at the prosperity and the contractionary cycle. So again, like other cycles, they have stages, they're predictable, they're repetitive, all these kinds of things still apply. And so first thing I want you to note that the prosperity is in green, contractionary is in red. So the prosperity cycle in itself is one thing. The contractionary cycle in itself is another thing. And so they don't both happen at the same time. I'm just giving you this one graph or one chart to show you both of them in effect. So if we're looking at the prosperity cycle, look at all the green arrows. And so in the prosperity cycle, if GDP starts to increase, what does that mean? That means production's going to go up. Okay, production is going up because people are spending more money, economic activity is increasing, production is going up. And so if production goes up, that means that they need to hire more people, they need to utilize more resources, so employment is going up. And if people have more jobs, people have more money. So income goes up, and if people have more money, spending and consumption will go up. And as we know, the GDP equation is consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, exports minus imports. So if consumer spending goes up, that's going to lead to GDP going up once again. And then if GDP goes up again, production goes up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the prosperity cycle. And so once we enter the prosperity cycle, the hope is that we can start to reverse the impacts and to start to bounce off of that trough and start getting better again and let that cycle build and build and build until we are in a much better situation. The contractionary cycle is the exact same in the fact that if GDP goes down, production starts to go down, as we can see what's happening right now. People get laid off, people lose their jobs, have no money, spending much less money, all these kinds of things. And so the contractionary cycle also feeds off of itself, and it's going to be problematic going into the future. And so those two things are very important to understand, that one, I guess, policy or impact or thing is not just going to impact one thing. It's hopefully going to kickstart a cycle and kickstart a prosperity, or to stop a contractionary cycle, right? So that's why things like stimulus packages, fiscal policy we hope that they work. And so a bit more on the prosperity and the contractionary cycles. One might ask, so if we get into the prosperity cycle, so why can't we just stay there and have economic growth forever? Which is what we kind of do have sometimes, that we extend our times of recovery, expansion, and prosperity. We extend those times, and every government's trying to extend these times more and more and more and more, right? And so we want to ensure that people want to ensure that this happens. And so I'm going to go back to our slide on the actual cycle and just going to show you what might some of the impacts be of doing that. So back in this graph, if you look at this trend line, so if we assume that the trend line is relatively linear, or it's at least sloping up at a relatively consistent rate, what do we think is going to happen if, say, this blue expansionary period starts extending farther and farther and farther up? Okay, if we believe that cycles are predictable and cycles are going to happen, if we overextend this line, what might happen after our peak? Our contraction might also be deep and painful, right? And so, again, that's if you assume that this trend line is relatively consistent. And again, that's not always the case, and our technology advancements may move the line at a faster rate up. But again, if we extend this unnaturally too high, our crashes might be unnaturally deeper than we had hoped, right? Versus a relatively stable ebb and flow of up and down of the cycle. So it's important to understand that the prosperity cycle does exist and we can influence it, but there are people who say that too much influence is not a good thing. And then if we go back to Adam Smith, how the government interventions might not always be a good idea, that's part of what may be happening. So back to talking about the prosperity contractionary cycles, and so influencing them. And so why can't our prosperity cycle last forever? Why can't the expansion just keep on happening as we'd all want it to? Aside from my point that I just made, but the reality is that an expansion can't keep on happening because we have limited capacity and resources, right? We can try to get faster and grow more and more and more and more, but ultimately we might not be able to do that, right? Um, our capacity is going to get us to stop, right? Our capacity is going to get us to a point where we don't want to go more because the trade-off between output and inflation is going to be poor in the future. Eventually, aggregate demand is satisfied. People can make more and more and more money, but not always need to spend more and more money. So maybe they still just save more money, and so ultimately maybe your aggregate demand will be satisfied as an individual or as a country, right? Generally, things slow down. This is not scientific or analytical very much, but things will slow. Um, we can't keep on going gangbusters that long. And like what's just happened now with COVID, this is not a natural disaster nor a war, but this is a situation that's impacted our society that was kind of out of our control. That's kind of almost like a natural. This is equivalent to a natural disaster, and maybe more so, right? Because we can't see an end, right? We don't know what's going to happen, right? And so all these things can stop expansions, can stop the cycles, and so. In this time, it's where we're experiencing a stop in the cycle. We're experiencing that blip, that crash, right? So that's why an expansion can't last forever. As in terms of a contraction, so in reality, when we talk about government interventions and we talk about policies, we're never talking about policies, or not never. We're not often talking about policies to slow down our expansion. We do, governments do that, and governments should do it more, and we'll talk about that probably tomorrow or the next day. But most often we talk about contractionary cycles and how do we stop a contractionary cycle. And so what can stop a contractionary cycle, or what does stop a contractionary cycle? So again, this is very similar to our generally things will slow down. Eventually it'll turn around. It's not scientific, it's not analytical, but that will happen, and here's why. Spending that was put off before eventually must happen. So what does this mean? So as an example, if there's a big recession and people are all saving their money, I'm still buying food, right? I'm still doing what I have to do. But if money is tight and we're uncertain, we see getting that new car as something that's a luxury that we don't do. If I have a car that works, I'm not going to splurge on getting a new car. And so in a contraction, that's going to happen. But if my car breaks down, I'm going to go ahead and buy a new car or a used car, or I'm going to put money into getting a new vehicle because I have to. I have to spend that money. Same with a washing machine, and same with any large appliance where you might go without for a little while, but ultimately you have to start spending that money. And these are all big ticket items for individuals, for businesses, for families, for whatever they may be. Spending that was put off before will eventually happen, and you'll have to get it done. That will increase capital spending, and that will impact GDP, and that might be a kickstart or eventually slowly push back. Government intervention was what I alluded to, talking about like stimulus packages, tax breaks, all these kinds of things to inject income into our economy, which will induce spending and so on and so forth to try to get us out of this contraction, or at least slow it down. All these things can help an economy. So these are the prosperity and contractionary cycles, and they live within the larger business cycle. And this business cycle is continuing up and down over economic activity or economy in general. And so a relatively straightforward lesson, but understanding that we are going to go through these peaks, contraction, troughs, expansion all the time. And in your lifetime, you're going to go through many of them. You're going to feel the crashes, and you're going to feel the expansions, the good times and the bad times, right? So knowing and understanding this is going to help us understand why and how governments are going to try to influence this, and why they're trying to influence this, and sometimes why their decisions are poor, or maybe why you might think, you know what, that wasn't a good choice. I don't think we should be doing that. And so this is just a good primer. Please make sure you watch and do all the homework. Again, if you have any questions, please send me a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I will see you later.